Hey, I hope you're well. I just want to talk today a little bit about diagnosing technique. How do you figure out what's wrong? And so many of you out there watching this, you're trying to figure that out for yourselves, which I commend you for that. And there's so much information available to you that it is possible. It is possible to diagnose, to learn the right information, to then apply what it is that you learn. But you have to know a couple kind of markers along the way so you don't get lost and you don't kind of drift off into other paths that don't really make any sense. So a phrase that's been really helpful for me over the years, I first heard this probably 15 years ago from a coach that I worked with at my last full-time job at Congressional Country Club. His name was David, and he always used to say, "The ball never lies." In other words, whatever the ball does, even if you don't see the swing, you can work your way back based on how the ball responds, how it flies through the air, the height, the speed, the spin, how it responds to the court when it bounces on the other side. And if you spend enough time kind of studying the cause and effect, then you can work your way back and pretty closely, like I would say within somebody who's really experienced, who's been doing this a long time, I would say 90-95% can recreate more or less like what happened on the other side and kind of piece it together. So let's take like a specific example of this. And this is a student that I had just last week. And he wrote to me before our time together, and he said that his backhand slice was really frustrating him because the ball wasn't moving through the court at all. And it was just kind of like sitting there, and it was getting teed up for his opponents. So like let's look at the tech. Well, no, let me walk you through it the other way around. So when I read that and he just sent me a sentence or two of description basically saying what I just said, I know automatically. I don't know exactly what it looks like, but there's two forces at play. There's two forces at play. Anytime somebody hits a ground stroke, you've got your lateral force, like how much energy is going through the ball. Let me get a different color here. How much energy is going through the ball in this direction, and you have your vertical force. Either the racket at contact is going to be coming up in this direction, or it's going to be coming down in this direction. Upwards is for topspin, and downwards is for slice. And so, very generally, very broadly speaking, you have those two forces. And if there's a mismatch, then the ball is going to respond in two very different ways. If there's way too much forward energy and there's very little downward, like vertical energy, then you're going to have a slice, and kind of put that in air quotes, you're going to have a slice that travels through the court really aggressively. And it's basically a drive with a little bit of backspin, right? So there's not going to be much like float to it. There's not going to be much hang to it. The ball is going to basically just be driven through the court with very minimal like skidding or sliding that like a really, solid slice would typically have. Like a middle of the road, like neutral slice is going to have a little bit of hang, a little bit of float. It's going to bounce on the other side and have a little bit of skid or skip through the court. And so if you do that wrong, if you mismatch and your racket path travels through the court more than the racket travels downwards, then you're going to have very little amount of backspin and a ton of drive. So what about the other end of the spectrum? What if there's like a ton of downward energy through contact and there's just a little bit of forward energy through contact? Well, what would happen then? Well, the downward part of the swing is what creates the backspin. So if there's a ton of downward energy and almost no forward energy, then what are we going to have? We're going to have a ton of backspin, but very little penetration or drive through the court, which is basically what my student was describing. He was saying, like, I like my slice, but it just kind of sits there. So that means there's not much forward, which means there's an overabundance of downwards. So check out that. So this is before we talked at all. This is before we did any kind of analysis. So watch this swing here, and I'll do it slow first. So watch the path of the racket, and look at how there's tons of downward energy here, but very little forward energy. Lots of downward, very little forward. When you see professional players hit a slice, the racket doesn't just chop down and just stay down. It goes down and then comes up again, and the racket finishes around shoulder height because the racket's being pulled forwards just as much as it's being pulled downwards. And so there's kind of a U shape to a really high quality slice that's very well balanced. And so it has penetration and drive, but it also has the backspin, which is what makes it a slice. So what we worked on with my student here was teaching him how to pull through as he comes down to balance those forces. So I share this just as a specific case study or example of the ball never lies. When he describes to me, here's what the ball is doing on this shot, I don't even have to see his technique. I mean, eventually I do. If I'm going to work with him in person and be like, okay, well, currently you're doing this and you should be doing that. Obviously, I need the specific like images, not just for me, but for him to show him, here's what you're doing now, and we need to move in XYZ direction, right? But it's just sitting on the other end of the internet, like reading the description, I already kind of know what direction I'm heading in. So for you at home, watch the ball closely and start to just make connections in your own mind between when I do this type of swing, the ball does that. And when I do that type of swing, the ball does this. And start to notice like little subtle nuances between like different paths of the racket, different angles of the racket, different swing speeds. I'm trying to think. It basically comes down to those three things: the speed, the path, and the angle of the racket face at contact. Turning those three dials, we can create any shot, like the entire spectrum of tennis shots, like a million different flavors of tennis shot, locations and spins and curves and heights and depths, and the whole thing just comes down to those three dials being turned. So in that sense, it's actually very complicated because subtle, small changes to different one of those three dials can make a seemingly like very different result on the other side. And so you have to know which of those three dials needs to be turned. So in a nutshell, this is why like I like make a living like as a coach, is because I have studied the cause and effect enough times over a long enough period of time that I pretty much know like where to go and like what to call out and what to change, relatively quickly, compared to somebody who doesn't understand any of those relationships, is just totally guessing. And it's like, I don't know, like we'll try something totally not related. Like, oh, I need to, my follow through like needs to finish over my shoulder. It has nothing to do at all. Like, and it's just like, oh, well, I heard this in a lesson. Like I need to bend my knees or whatever. And it's completely unrelated to like what's happening to the ball. It might be related, but oftentimes tennis players pick things that are doesn't have anything to do with like what's frustrating them about the shot. So the ball never lies. If you can learn that cause and effect, you can reverse engineer and work your way back through your own technique and really fix like literally any problem. It's just a matter of how accurately you're able to pick out the different elements. Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that's helpful. Thanks for watching. Hope you're doing well. Keep up the good work on your game.